The night they pushed her out, the snow had already begun to fall, thin and sharp like it meant to cut rather than cover. She stood on the porch with a single suitcase, her fingers numb, her heart louder than the wind, watching the door close not just on her body but on every year she had tried to belong. The house lights stayed on behind the curtains, warm and careless, while she stepped into the dark with nowhere to go, no money worth counting, and a future that looked as empty as the road stretching away from that house. They had taken everything except her breath, and even that felt borrowed. If you believe stories about kindness, second chances, and quiet strength rising from nothing, take a moment right now to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel Wild West Tale, because this story begins where mercy ends and courage has no witnesses. She walked until the house disappeared. Then farther still, because stopping felt like surrender. The town at the edge of the valley was small enough to remember her face, and cruel enough to remember the version they preferred. She slept on benches and in borrowed corners, her pride folded tighter than the clothes in her case. Each morning she washed her face in cold sinks and told herself that survival was not the same as living, but it was a beginning. She searched for work, for any task that would trade sweat for coins, and when she found it, it was the kind that bent backs and broke spirits. She cleaned barns, stacked wood, scrubbed kitchens after midnight, and learned how hunger sharpens gratitude for the smallest mercy. The winter pressed down hard, and the town seemed to press harder, as if the world wanted proof that she would stay broken. The $5 cabin came to her as a rumor, the kind people laughed about because hope makes cynics uncomfortable. It sat on a sliver of land nobody wanted, half swallowed by trees, a relic from a time when men built with their hands and left with their mistakes. The roof sagged, the windows were blind with grime, and the door had learned to argue before opening. It belonged to a county list of forgotten properties, valued less than the paper it was written on. $5 was not a purchase so much as a dare, and she paid it with coins gathered from weeks of aching work. When she stood before it, breath fogging the air, she felt the strangest relief, as if the cabin understood her and asked nothing but patience. Living there meant learning a new language of cold and quiet. The walls breathed wind, the floor complained with every step, and the stove remembered heat only when begged. She hauled water from a creek that iced over without apology, chopped wood until blisters became calluses, and learned that silence can be louder than cruelty. At night, she wrapped herself in every layer she owned and listened to the forest settle, to the cabin creak like an old animal choosing to trust her. She cried when her hands shook too badly to light the fire, and she laughed when the fire finally caught, because laughter was lighter than fear. Each day she fixed one thing, even if that thing was only her resolve. Spring arrived like forgiveness she had not asked for. Snow pulled back to reveal soil willing to be touched, and she planted what she could afford. Seeds traded for labor and kindness returned for kindness given. She patched the roof with scavenged tin, sealed the worst of the gaps with clay and sawdust, and cleaned the windows until light found a way inside. The cabin began to look less like a wound and more like a scar that had healed enough to tell a story. She kept going because stopping would mean thinking about the faces behind that closed door, the voices that decided she was expendable. Instead, she thought about the way morning light landed on the table she built from scraps, about the smell of bread when she learned to bake it herself, about how dignity grows when no one is watching. Work came easier as word spread that she did not quit. She repaired fences, mended clothes, and learned trades from people who saw in her the labor they needed and the honesty they respected. She saved every coin not out of greed but out of gratitude, because money meant choices and choices meant freedom. The cabin gained shelves, then a proper door, then a garden fence that kept deer at a respectful distance. She painted the walls a pale color that caught the sun and made the space feel bigger than its square feet. Each improvement felt like a promise kept, and the forest seemed to approve, offering berries, birdsong, and the kind of peace that asks nothing in return. Summer tested her in new ways. Heat replaced cold, and storms arrived without warning, turning the creek wild and the path to town treacherous. She learned to read the sky, to prepare before disaster announced itself, to anchor what mattered. When lightning struck a nearby tree and fire licked at the edge of her land, she fought it with buckets and courage until neighbors arrived, drawn by smoke and respect. They saw her then, really saw her, not as a rumor or a cautionary tale, but as a woman who stood her ground. From that day, help came more freely, and she gave it back twice as hard, because community is not claimed but built. The cabin began to change others, not just her. People came to trade, to rest, to listen. She learned to cook meals that stretched and warmed, to tell stories without bitterness, to let joy be simple. She carved shelves and chairs, sold what she made, and reinvested in the place that had given her shelter, when pride had nowhere else to go. The land responded with abundance, and she learned that care multiplies. She did not forget the past, but she refused to live in it, choosing instead to turn memory into mortar, holding the future together with lessons learned the hard way. Autumn painted the trees gold and red, and with it came an offer she did not expect. Travelers saw her work and spoke of markets beyond the valley, of demand for honest craft and stories that felt true. She hesitated, because leaving meant risking the balance she had fought for. But growth rarely asked permission. She prepared carefully, leaving the cabin secured and her heart steady, and returned weeks later with pockets heavier and confidence heavier still. She expanded the garden, improved the stove, and added a small porch where she could sit and watch the world, arrive instead of chasing it. Time did what time always does. It carried news. The people who had closed the door heard about the cabin, about the woman who had turned $5 into a life. At first it came as disbelief, then as curiosity, then as envy dressed as concern. She felt it before she saw them, the old weight pressing on her chest, the instinct to shrink. But she did not. She stood taller, because the ground beneath her belonged to her now, earned inch by inch. When they came, they saw not a ruin but a home, not a victim, but a builder. The regret in their eyes was quiet and heavy, and it did not ask for forgiveness because regret rarely does. She did not gloat, because victory that needs witnesses is hollow. She offered courtesy without surrender, boundaries without cruelty. The cabin stood between them like proof, its walls warm, its windows bright, its door open by choice rather than obligation. They left with less than they brought, carrying the understanding that some doors close to teach us how to build our own. She watched them go and felt nothing like triumph, only a clean sadness, the kind that means healing has taken place. Years layered themselves gently. The cabin became a hub for stories and skills, a place where people learned to mend, to plant, to begin again. She taught what she had learned and learned what she could, because stagnation is a quieter failure than defeat. She expanded the land responsibly, honoring the forest that had sheltered her, and found that giving back kept her grounded. The valley changed, or perhaps it was only her view of it that did, sharpened by experience and softened by gratitude. When hardship returned, as it always does, she met it with preparation rather than panic. Drought came and she conserved. Illness brushed close and she rested. Markets shifted and she adapted. Each challenge reminded her that resilience is not a single act, but a habit. She kept the $5 receipt framed on the wall, not as a joke, but as a reminder that value is decided by effort and care, not by price tags or opinions. In quiet moments, she thought about the night she had been thrown out, about the snow and the suitcase and the fear. She honored that version of herself by living well, by choosing generosity without self-erasure, by turning pain into purpose. The cabin was no longer just wood and nails. It was a testament, a living answer to anyone who believed endings are decided by others. If this story has touched your heart, if it has reminded you that dignity can be rebuilt and hope can be handcrafted from scraps, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to Wild West Tale so more stories like this can find their way to the people who need them most. And before the ending, leave a comment telling us where you have found strength when you had nothing left, because your story matters too. She closed the cabin door one evening with the sun sinking low, the forest breathing easy around her. Inside, warmth waited, honest and earned. Outside, the world kept turning, but it no longer decided her worth. $5 had bought a ruin, and patience had turned it into a life. That was their regret and her freedom, and it stood solid as the ground beneath her feet.